Hello and welcome to Homicide Hobbies. I'm Andy,
And I'm Claire.
and we're here to talk about some of the disturbing things that go on in the world, past and present. We feel like not knowing doesn't mean the crazy doesn't exist.
So we're going to scar you with the knowing.
Enjoy.
So what do you got for us today, Claire?
Today, we're going to head to Locust Grove, Oklahoma in the 70s. Now, Locust Grove is a small town in Mays County. It's a rural county, so there's not much to do. It's basically anything woodsy, so hiking, blah, blah, blah. There's lakes, so naturally when kids are out of school, that's what people do. They'll either be hiking or just go to the water, do your fishing, all the things. Now, in particular, we're going to focus on one area of Locust Grove. In particular, we're going to focus on a Girl Scout camp called Camp Scott.
Oh, I've heard this case before. Okay, I won't ruin it.
You just did. Now, Camp Scott was deep in the woods on 410 acres, where there was only one road in the front of the camp and then the one out the back. So one in, one out. Now, girls were typically bussed in and were divided up by age group once they arrived at the camp. And on average, they'd have about 230 of campers, and then 30 staff, 10 counselors, and training along with a ranger and his family when camp was in session. Now, it also wasn't out of the norm for when camp was in session. The young boys would drive out to the camp to try to scare the girls at night, so much so that the sheriff would get into a routine of going by to scare off the hooligans. Now, when camp was in session, the tents, they were arranged in like a U shape. The counselor or the camp counselors were in the first tent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're going to focus on 1977 at Camp Scott. In March, a camp counselor would discover that her belongings were ransacked and her donuts had been stolen during a training session.
Sorry.
I did laugh at it. It's like, the horror! Now, inside the empty box of donuts was a handwritten note. In all caps read, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in 1 tent." Now, the note also mentioned something about Martians. Like, it just seemed just weird. Now, you also have to factor in that they have hoodlums that try to scare people, all that. So the camp director would figure it's just another prank and tosses it out. Later on, again, same time frame, someone would find like a man doll thing made out of sticks hanging by its neck from a tree and just hook it up to some weird shit.
Well, it is weird.
Well, people do weird things. Like, it seems like people like to try to scare the people in the woods, so that's what they hawk it up to. Now, a few weeks would go by and nothing comes of the note, and it would start to fade from everybody's memory, and again, as just a prank in poor taste. Now, 5 days before the next camp session would start, a slash in the backside of one of the tents was discovered. It was about 3 feet long. They do end up repairing it. But at that same time, a hatchet goes missing. And we're going to fast forward to June 12th, 1977. So again, same year, just a few weeks later. It's about 7 p.m. It's the night before camp officially starts, but 100 girls would arrive for that week of fun and outdoorsy activities. But it's the next day, so this is just really an arrival day, a meet and greet kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
We've got 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer, 10-year-old Doris Denise Miller, and 9-year-old Michelle Heather Guzet. Now, they're all natives of Oklahoma, but they were bussed in. Now, they're snuggled down in Tent 7 when a thunderstorm would start rolling in. Now, the 3 girls hadn't met before that day. Michelle had been to Camp Scott before and knew it pretty well. Denise didn't want to go to camp because she had 2 of her friends that were supposed to go, but they backed out at the last minute. And she really didn't want to be there because she didn't know anyone there. But her mom would encourage her to go anyway and enjoy the experience. Now, there was supposed to be a 4th girl in their tent, but she wasn't coming to the next morning, but she was also supposed to be the girls' tent mate. But Lori, Denise, and Michelle would spend that day together doing activities and would even write letters home. Lori would write to her mother telling her she's got 2 new friends already, Denise and Michelle. Now, Tent 7, you know how I told you those tents are set up in a U shape, and the first tent is the counselors?
Mm-hmm.
Which, by the way, I think that's weird anyway. You would think they would have 2, like, you know, somebody in the caboose.
Right.
But
you would think.
They, or at least age-wise, like the youngest up front, and then the older, more maybe tent or camp experience girls in the back. But anyway, it's set up in a U shape. The counselors are up front. Lori, Denise, and Michelle are in tent 7, which is at the end of this U shape and also the farthest from the camp counselor's tent. And it also happens to be partially blocked from view because that's where the camp showers are. So if the camp counselors came out, they can't really see tent 7 from where they're at.
Right. Makes sense.
Now, throughout the night, several campers and counselors would hear weird noises in the night. Naturally, the girls would hawk it up to, they're in the woods, it's new, everything is scary, all the noises are weird. And I personally would think, as a young kid, I never went to camp, but I would think that that could be real scary at night.
Just a little. And they're little. It's not even like they're teenagers scared of what goes bump in the night. These are like little girls. It's normal to be
scared.
And
since they're really from the suburbs or the city, that this is how they're getting their woodsy experience, they don't know what all the animals and noises in the night really sound like. And when you take away all the house noises, you really don't know what's normal or not. Now, one of the camp counselors, Carla Wilhite, would investigate the noises she heard around 1 a.m., something between a foghorn and a bullfrog. She really didn't know what was making the noise, so she goes out of her tent with her flashlight to try to see what the hell the noise is. And when she shines her light in that direction, the noise stops. So she stands there for a minute, shining her flashlight, straining real hard to hear anything, doesn't hear anything. She turns to head back to bed, and then she hears a noise again. So she turns around with her flashlight, shines it in that direction, the noise stops again. Now, she's also doing the whole, again, the hoodlums that like to try to scare people. She stands there for a little bit, waiting for somebody to pop out and be like, gotcha. But nothing happens. The noise isn't doing it again, so she turns to go back into her tent, and the noise starts again. So she's just like, it's got to be an animal, since every time she turns her light, it's quiet. Whatever. So she goes back to bed. Now, she's not real sure if the noise finally stopped or she just fell asleep. But 30 minutes after about that time, another camper in a tent would be woken up when someone shines a flashlight in her tent, which was weird, but then the person goes away, so no idea what that was about. Then about 3 a.m.
I would have thought, if I were in her shoes, that one of the kids were up.
Well, I think that's why she shined her light. Because it was just like she heard a noise, and then you'd think if one of the girls was up, they're not hiding. They've got no reason to hide. So it's just like it was weird that it stopped. And my guess would be the girls also know where the camp counselor's tent is. So if there was an issue, it was weird that she was out there. The noise stopped. She turned, it'd start again. She turned back, and then it'd go quiet. So that's why she assumed some sort of creature was in the night. Now, around 3 a.m., another girl heard a scream come somewhere near tent 7, and around that same time, another camper would hear a scream, followed by someone crying, "Mama."
Aww.
Now, the girls didn't know what to do, and I'm sure the idea of running out in the darkness was terrifying, so they both just try to go to sleep. Now, it's about 6 a.m. the next morning. Camp counselor Carla, the same one who went out to investigate the noise, she would head to the showers real early in the morning because she knew full well once everybody was up that hot water's not going to last. So she starts walking to the showers when she sees sleeping bags in the road and thinks, crap. When they were dropping off the girls' stuff, that one of the sleeping bags or some of their stuff was dropped in the road. So she's like, crap. So she goes over there to grab the sleeping bags when she sees that there's a girl in the bag, which at first she's confused doing the whole, why is she sleeping outside her tent? And she's about 150 yards from the tent area. So no, her first thought was she must have got up in the night and then ran smack into a tree is what her first thought was.
She thinks real highly of her.
So
fellow
you got to bear in
campers.
mind she's a teenage camp counselor. So her teenage brain wasn't thinking that somebody got killed, because that's what she realizes as she gets closer, that girl's not sleeping. She's dead.
That's gotta be horrifying.
Dude, I can't imagine. Now Carla goes running to get the director, who is stunned, and the other counselors are all like, what the fuck? And then they do the whole, okay, we got to get a head count. That way we can figure out what's going on and go from there. Now, panic spreads amongst the counselors as they're doing that head count when they realize the 3 girls from tent 7 are all gone, so are their sleeping bags. So they begin searching for the other girls, when they discover the other 2 girls are shoved in the other sleeping bags and zipped up.
That's sad.
Where the first girl was.
Yeah.
Now, the 2 other girls, since they were younger, they were crumpled at the bottom, and that's why they weren't able to be seen from the outside. Now, by this point, the police had already arrived and are beginning the investigation of the scene and collecting evidence. Now, the rest of the campers are moved off the campsite under the guise that they lost their water source in an effort to shield the girls from learning what happened the night before. Because again, they're all young girls. How do you explain to them 3 of their campers died in the night and all those weird noises everybody heard was most likely them getting killed?
Oh my God.
So that's what they tell the rest of these girls, and that since they don't have water, that they can't be there because they can't bathe, they can't cook, they can't do anything. So they would load them up on buses and send them back home. Now, from this day, that camp never reopens, and I understand that, like, the whole thing. How do you reopen that? During the police investigation, it was determined that the 3 little girls had been bludgeoned and strangled to death. And if that wasn't horrific enough, all 3 had been restrained with duct tape and raped. Now, Denise had a gag and rope still tied around her head and appeared to have been the last to die.
Poor baby.
Lori and Michelle had blows to their head that most likely knocked them unconscious, and I hope they never came to and were just knocked out, because they also had severe vaginal lacerations on top of their other injuries.
Those poor babies.
Now, Denise had clearly lived the longest and had been struck several times in the face. Her eyes were swollen shut because of her skull fractures. Now, a large red flashlight was found with the girls' bodies with smudged fingerprints on the lens, but it was too smudged to really, they're just partial fingerprints, so that made things difficult. They find a bloody shoe print on the floor of the tent that was roughly size 9.5. They also find shoe prints around the tent area. Hair had also been collected in the duct tape that had been wrapped around the girls' wrists. Now, a home near the camp, they would talk to the people who were home, and they said they heard a car coming from the remote part of the camp around 2:30, 3 o'clock. Now, Sheriff Pete Weaver, he would be on scene and go, "I know exactly who did this." Now, put a pin in that for a minute while your brain hole adjusts to all that horrificness.
How big is Camp Scott? Do you know?
I told you in the beginning, 410 acres.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's rural. It's exactly what you would, or well, at least what I would expect when you think wilderness. Now, enter into the story 34-year-old Gene Leroy Hart, who was a local, born and raised. His ma raised him, and his pa was a Cherokee Indian who was an absentee pa. Now, before Gene takes a turn down a criminal path, he was a pretty good athlete in school, but that all changed in 1966 when he's 23 years old. It would be in June of 66 when Gene would spot 2 young pregnant chicks in a parking lot outside of a nightclub. He would abduct the girls, forcing them to ride in the trunk, and at several points during their drives, he would take one or both of them out of the car to ride along next to him. He would brutally rape and sodomize both women. He's a sick man, but he would take their glasses off to check out their prescription strength and how they looked on him. Just really fucking with them, both literally and figuratively there.
What is wrong with him?
I don't know. Once he's done with riding around with them and doing all his rapings, he would tie them up and leave them in the woods in Mays County. Now, when they're eventually found, they know who did it. So they would go and arrest Gene, and he would confess to kidnapping and raping and sodomizing the 2 women. He would be sentenced to 3 10-year sentences to be served concurrently, which would leave him to be paroled just 28 months later. Now, out on the town, Gene would try his hand at some burglary. He would burglarize 3 homes in just 24 hours, but it wasn't until he made the error in judgment to burglarize the home of a Tulsa police officer, which is the home he was caught and arrested for. Then they find evidence in his car of the previous burglaries, so he'd be charged with 4 counts of burglary. Now, because he's on parole for his raping and kidnapping charges, he would be sentenced to 350 years of prison time, which I found particularly disgusting because he should have gotten that for his kidnapping and rape.
Yeah, but no, that's not how they looked at it.
No. So Gene would be sent back to the county jail to await his hearing, But he would escape. He would be convinced by a friend to turn himself in after 10 days on the lam and would return back to jail. But he didn't like jail, so he'd break out again in 1973, and he would remain on the run for several years. But that's enough about his background. We're going to go back to our Girl Scouts where we're picking up on they're investigating that scene. Now, Sheriff Pete Weaver is like, I know who done this. It's Gene Leroy Hart. Now, mind you, Sheriff Pete Weaver was not trained to investigate a murder, let alone the complicated one the Girl Scouts murders are. And it was questionable if he was really even qualified to be sheriff because he had a background in cattle ranching and owning a restaurant. He didn't have law enforcement training. So he was pretty much just a small time politician. But it didn't stop him from announcing that he would shoot Gene on sight if he ran.
Wow.
Which seems like one of those... Okay, so with absolutely no experience in investigating shit, he's just gonna say, this is who done it, and I'm gonna shoot him if I see him.
Well, did he do it?
Now, you also gotta bear in mind that we're in Cherokee country, and the time frame of stereotypes and racism and all of that of you got people who just don't like the Indians. So the word would spread among the Cherokee Nation that they're going to shoot Gene on sight. Now, where you figure if people don't think he did it, they're still willing to help him because they don't think he's going to get a fair shake. And I've got to say, if he's been on the run since he broke out of jail for 4 years and you're just going to suddenly say this is who did it, it doesn't seem like he'd get a fair shake.
So I don't think that guy would get a fair shake, but if he's been on the run for several years, what makes this sheriff think that the guy's still local? And if he keeps occasionally seeing him, or is it one of those he stays on like the reservation type area and then regular law enforcement doesn't have the authorization to go onto the reservation to arrest him, and that's how he was able to be an escapee for so long?
You're getting ahead of the story a little bit. So Camp Scout is technically on the Indian reservation, but it's not going to be later on till down the road when Cherokee marshals are actually given authority to have investigations on things. So you're ahead of your time right now.
I was more or less not getting ahead of my time, but asking. So the sheriff that you're saying is just a politician. Mm-hmm. How can he say he's going to shoot him on sight? That means that he's got an escaped convict that he sees regularly enough to say, I know this is the guy that did it, and I'm going to shoot him the next time I see him. Meaning, he's crossed paths with him, even though he knows he's an escaped convict. Why wouldn't you just arrest him because he's an escaped convict? Why is he still off on the loose? And
hold your pantyhose. So he hasn't seen him. He's been on the loose for those 4 years, but they're about to start a manhunt looking for him. So they're just saying, spread the word. If when we finally see him, he doesn't cooperate and goes to run, we're shooting him. We're not giving chase. So let that spread. And now their also issue is Gene was born and raised in that area, just a mile from Camp Scott. So it's also, with him being a member of the Cherokee Nation, that he's got a lot of relatives and friends in the area. So not only does he know the woods through and through, but he knows people to be able to help keep him hidden. So they'd band together several hundred volunteers to walk the woods to try to shake out if he's hiding in the woods. They even enlist the help of dogs to find any traces of him in the woods. Now, they would find nothing, and the dogs would actually end up with heat stroke.
Oh.
It wouldn't be until 2 squirrel hunters happened upon a cave.
You're so weird.
I love when we've got squirrel hunters, turtle trappers, and mushroom hunters in stories. These are really the unsung heroes of all the murder cases that go solved.
It's so weird.
But anyhow,
I don't know how you end up with so many weird hunters in your stories.
You just aren't looking hard enough.
No, I find the hammer-wielding, panty-sniffing, pube-collecting murderers. You find the mushroom hunters and squirrel hunters.
We all have our talents. Now, those 2 squirrel hunters would find photographs of local women, like professionally taken, who lived near the jail and turn them over to authorities. Now, the photographer that had taken them, because I imagine since photography in this time frame, you got to bear in mind is a pricey but a pricey profession, because at that point you have to develop the shit. Like, there's not a lot of photographers in a small town. so it wasn't real hard to figure out who the photographer was that had taken them. But he had also worked at the jail, where Gene, as his prison job, was assigned to assist him when he was in the jail. Now, the cave had also previously been a hideout of Gene's when he would break out of jail. Now, there were rumors that Gene was still attending funerals, family barbecues, football games, and had been spotted around town plenty. There were even rumors that he had magical Cherokee shape-shifting powers, and that's why they couldn't catch him.
Sorry.
I will say I did like a, all right, this took a weird turn. Not that when we start in with the squirrel hunters, things don't start getting weird from there. But I was like, all right. Now, the police would turn to Cherokee families as a source of help because at this point, they're about 8 to 10 months into searching for him. And I feel like with how the girls were killed, you gotta play on people's concern of this person is on the loose. Your children are in danger. If they can do this to these little girls, why would you want to hide him?
Yeah, if you don't care about the pregnant women that he raped,
right,
then at least care about the 3 little girls that he raped and murdered.
Now, like I said, it would be months before they're able to catch up with him, and they do get a tip of where Gene's at, and they would go and arrest him at the home of Cherokee Medicine Man in April 1978. He's about 50 miles from the camp at this point.
I wonder who turned his ass in. They deserve an award.
Now, when he's arrested, they skip the county jail and take him straight to the state prison, which I laughed at because they knew he'd escaped twice, so at least they had the sense enough not to bring him back to where he knows how to get out.
Yeah.
But his trial for the 3 girls' murder would start in March 1979. All the while, Gene would plead his innocence. Now, the photographer who took the pictures that were found in the caves testified that he did take those photographs, and Gene did assist him, which would be that connection. A deputy would also testify that those same photos had been in the sheriff's office previously, which is mighty suspicious to me. So I was going off of...
What's wrong with the photos?
So that's how they linked him near the caves, which if that placed him near the caves, then people were saying he was in the area when it happened. And I'm going to say I side with the Cherokees on this one of this seems awful stinky of a setup because nothing pointed to Gene. This seems like grasping at straws. And it was real confusing to me that it's not like they were pictures of the girls. It wasn't their possessions. So where's this link?
Yeah.
Now, evidence was also submitted that said that sperm at the crime scene matched sperm found in Gene's undies that he had left behind when he made a break for it.
Ew.
Which was kind of specially level of ew to me because... And it also made me skeptical that Gene was being set up because if he had been on the run for 4 years prior to the murders, why were they holding on to this man's crusty undies? So that seemed mighty suspicious to me.
That's
but they
so
also,
gross.
I was like, oh, who went, hey, I got these. Will they be help to you? Look at this. There's a stain right there. Like, whose job was that? I don't know. Like, I guess they have to hold on to somebody's possessions for a certain amount of time. But I was like,
I guess once it's evidence, but ugh.
4 years. 4 years and 10 months, they held on to those sperm-covered undies. 4 of those years, it was prior to a crime occurring that they would be utilized. So I did the whole, sure, they found them in the jail. I feel like it was more likely they seized some dirty, crusty undies from that house when they arrested him, but maybe they didn't want to say where they fished him out of.
It's disgusting.
I feel like if Sonny made a prison break and I was assigned to go clean out their possessions from their cell, that shit would be going in the trash. Like, fucking foul. He's not coming back for these, and if he is, sorry, not sorry.
Yeah.
The dick rags are in the trash. Anyway, they would also have the hair that was found on the duct tape that matched that of someone who was Native American. Now, mind you, we're in the time period that DNA testing isn't available, so where they did match the hair to being of a similar type of genes, they can't say 100% that that is Gene's hair, but just rather somebody who probably is Native American. Now, there was also a struggle with the shoe prints found. Because Gene wore a size 11.5, and the print was determined to be a Vietnam boot, that was a 9.5. So it's just like, all right, whose shoes were those? Not only that, but the fingerprints on the flashlight, I realized that they were partials, but those didn't match Gene's fingerprints either. And that flashlight was with the girls' bodies. Now, the Cherokees would believe that the evidence was manufactured, and I'm not gonna lie, I think it certainly looks that way. Now, the sheriff would state he was 1,000% sure that they had their man. Now, the turmoil this case brought the town, I can't even say. I mean, I can only imagine, but you figure the uproar, just having 3 little girls brutally murdered like that is enough to make anybody upset. But then you also got the turmoil of those who think he's innocent and then those who are convinced he's guilty.
I'm just a little confused here because, and it's not one that I know that you'll be able to answer, but
you don't know.
If he escaped prison because he was already a convicted rapist, who is it that's siding with him saying it's beyond a reasonable doubt that he didn't do this? You know what I mean? Like, if I knew someone...
You're confusing me with your questions. You threw too many knots and fours. Are you asking who would think he wasn't guilty?
Yeah.
So I think because the way the evidence was, and because early on in the investigation, the sheriff did the whole, he knew who did it and named who did it before really anything linked Gene, it sounds like the sheriff has it out for Gene and is just going to make this one fit. Rather than going with evidence and letting the evidence lead you a direction to find a suspect, it seems like they gave themselves somebody to pin it on and then shape everything around it.
Right. And I understand that. And if anything, I would say it's the girls' families that should be fighting to make sure that it's an actual investigation. But the feller Gene, to start with, before the girls are killed, he's already going back to prison because he raped those 2 women and then broke into an officer's home. He was already on a bad track. He should have been in jail. Nobody should have been hiding him because what he was doing, even if he didn't kill the girls, he deserved to be in prison for what he had already been convicted of. You know what I mean? Like, he 100% did those crimes. Why would someone hide him? They deserve to be in jail for aiding and abetting a fugitive. And if anything, I think it should have been the girls who were murdered, whose families were like, make sure you're actually investigating, because I realize this feller deserves to be in jail for other crimes that he committed, but I would want 100% that the right person, not...
Well, you figure the sheriff said he's 1,000% sure, so I don't know if it was the pressure to solve the case, and he just figured Gene's supposed to be in jail for life anyway, so that's where... I don't know if he deliberately, or if maybe he actually believed it himself, that that's who did it. But I kind of figure since this is a small town, they almost figured it was Gene because he's already a rapist.
Yeah.
What's to stop him from diddling little girls if he is going to go around there? But mind you, I looked at it skeptically because when he was arrested for kidnapping and raping the 2 women, he admitted to it. So why, if he's going back to jail for his 300-year sentence anyway, why wouldn't he admit to what he did if he did it? So I think it was also a little odd that he was like, I didn't do it. And then all the evidence seems to be like, it doesn't look like that'd be the case. As much as you want it to be him, it doesn't appear like that's the case. They had such tunnel vision, and I think that's why he had supporters, because it's also around that same time where it wasn't outside the realm of possibilities that somebody was being set up because they were Cherokee.
Right, but he still deserves to be in prison.
But I've realized that, but you're saying you were wondering how he had found people, because nobody was saying he didn't deserve to be in jail.
They are if they're hiding him.
Okay, fine. But the people outside the courthouse are doing the whole, you can't pin it on somebody who didn't do it, because then that means the person who did do it is still out there side of things.
Yeah.
The jury would feel that there wasn't enough evidence, and also the way things were collected was sloppy. They didn't grasp how they connected him to the murders at all, if nothing at the scene connected him. I mean, you've got the hair, but again, you can't 100% say that's his hair. You can't change his fingerprints, and you can't change his shoe size. So it left plenty of room for reasonable doubt. Now, with all that doubt, the jury would acquit Gene after hearing evidence for 11 days. Now, I'm not saying that Gene didn't deserve to be in jail, because I do think he's a colossal piece of shit, but this seemed like one shitty investigation that was pointed at Gene from the start. And again, the good news in this is that that piece of shit would still have to serve his 305-year sentence of his 308-year sentence that he was stuck with to begin with. But unfortunately, he would drop dead of a heart attack in 1979 after an hour of lifting weights and jogging around his exercise yard. That was just 2 years after the murders, and I feel like wildly ripped off that he should have been in jail longer.
Because you wanted more butthole rapings for him?
Sure did. Now, in 1989, DNA testing would be done, but would be inconclusive, although they would say that it belonged to somebody of Native American heritage, but it didn't eliminate him as a suspect either. So it was real confusing when I was trying to read that one. Is it said of the 5 markers they looked at, 3 matched genes, but it was just like, it was a very degraded sample because of how it was collected and how it was kept. So where it wasn't 100%, it didn't eliminate him, but it didn't match him either, which I was like, how does it do both? Does that mean it was a relative?
No, it just means it's close enough, but they can't say it's not enough to say it's 100%.
Well, in 2017, they would retest the DNA since technological advances and all that. You need less DNA. There's things that they can do that they couldn't do back in the day. Now, the results would strongly suggest that Gene was involved, but the case would remain unsolved. Now, 2 of the families would sue the Magic Empire Council, which is the Girl Scout thing, for negligence, considering that they had a threatened note just a few weeks prior and did nothing. And then the fact that Tent 7 was 86 yards from the camp counselor's tent, and they put young girls out there who were inexperienced campers, so it seemed like grossly negligent to the parents. The jury would favor the Girl Scout place or the Magic Empire, and that $5 million lawsuit would be tossed out. Now, to thoroughly test your brain power, do you remember when I told you that Sheriff Weaver stated that he knew exactly who killed the girls and threw Gene's name out there?
Yeah.
As if he's the only Native American to commit any crimes?
Yeah.
Well, along that same time frame of when they're on the prowl for Gene and it's still being investigated, another police officer, Officer Paul Smith, with the Locust Grove PD, would decide to do some asking around town himself and run his own investigation because he wants that person off the streets. He's just not on board with it all seemed weird to just throw somebody's name out there. So now he's 2 miles outside the jurisdiction of where the murders occurred. So Officer Smith would hit the streets for information, primarily high school kids, since nothing happens in a small town without high school kids knowing something about it. Now, during his investigation, that's when he would also remember that he was sitting outside town. And again, it's small town, so it's kind of like one of those, the main road coming in. If you're just sitting around there, that you're going to notice all the comings and goings because that's the main avenue to come in and out of the town. Now, the day the girls were bussed in, he remembers seeing a Dodge Super Bee following behind the bus that was bringing the girls into town. Now, the reason it stuck out to him is he remembers seeing the driver and the passenger of the Super Bee because those 2 individuals he'd had multiple run-ins with because he's arrested them several times before. Now, the windows were tinted, so he really couldn't tell if there was a third man in the car, but one of the men was 19-year-old high school dropout Buddy Bristol, who was known to stalk girls and torture animals. He'd have a long history of being in and out of jail, which I think is particularly sad when you're talking about he's 19, so he doesn't have a long history of anything.
Yeah.
But one of the people Paul would talk to would tell him that they saw 2 men walking away from the camp early the morning of the murders without shirts. Now, 2 of the men walking were the same 2 men that were in the Super Bee that Paul had seen following the bus the day before the murders. That same informant said that the guy that had gone to a friend's home, that one of the guys, found somebody to take him to Tulsa, and also when he showed up to this gal's house went to ask for a ride to Tulsa, he didn't have a shirt or shoes on.
All right.
Now, that informant would say there was a third man in that car that day, and one of them fellers would say that the sister he had a routine of showing up at her house, mainly because he'd do drugs all the time and then just randomly pop up. But one of these days, he pops up, his clothes and shoes had blood all over them, and it was early in the morning, And she was just like, what the hell happened to you? And he's like, I killed a deer. And she was like, all right. And she recalls never before seeing him so high. But he would go sit on the floor in the kitchen and he would take 2 pie plates, fill one with water. Mind you, he's sitting on the floor, and take a spoon and take the water from one pie plate to the other until one was full, and then spoon the water back to the other side, all while repeating those little Girl Scouts. The next day, he would tell his sister if she said anything, he'd kill her, and she believed him. Now, Officer Smith would take that information straight to Sheriff Weaver, because again, it's outside his jurisdiction, so when he comes across this information, he's like, hey guy, I just heard all this shit, you should probably check it out. But Sheriff Weaver is doing the whole, yeah, we already know Gene did it, so we're going after him, and continuing his manhunt. Officer Smith would be fed up with the fact that he gave good evidence, they're not doing shit with it, and he would decide, fuck this garbage. 2 years later, during this whole Gene gets acquitted, all that, he decides he's going to run for sheriff. Mind you, Gene dies that same year in jail. That Officer Smith would actually end up winning the election in 1980 and would be sheriff from 1980 to 1984. And one of his campaign points was that he was going to solve this Girl Scouts murder where Sheriff Weaver had failed. Now, when he gets into the office, the case files and reports, and like when he opens up that filing cabinet, that file is empty.
How is that possible?
Exactly. I think the whole thing stinks, is what I think. Now, Paul would officially start his investigation into the murders, starting with the information on the 3 men that were in the Super Bee, none of which were Gene Hart. Now, he would get started with his primary suspect in 1981, Buddy Bristol, who just so happened to have ended up in jail for exposing himself to kids near the creek, not far from the camp, just 5 months after the murders. So Paul would go talk to him while he's still in there doing time. And Buddy would tell him that there were 3 of them that had been hanging out, drinking beer, doing drugs, and had been up for about 3 days when they decided to go over to the Girl Scout camp. Now, one of them had a crowbar, the other had a roofing hammer. The only reason Sheriff Smith was sharing these details now, because I'm just going to tell you this case stays unsolved, is that Buddy dies in 1981. The other 2 men are not ever named, and this case is disgusting. But he goes up to talk to Buddy, and according to Buddy, 2 of the men were armed. They went into the tent through the back. One hit Lori, and the other one hit Michelle, but Denise went running out the tent. They had to chase her down and grab her. Now, when the other men attacked the girls and were raping them, Buddy would say he did not take part in that. Whether he did or not, I don't know.
That's disgusting.
It was. But that Lori and Michelle died fairly quickly, and they planned to dump all the evidence and the bodies somewhere else. But when they were bagging them up into the sleeping bags and throwing everything in to get rid of the evidence, an alarm clock would go off that scared the shit out of them. And since they're high and drunk and been up for days, their little teeny tiny man brains just tell them to drop everything and take off. So that's why the shit was just dropped in the road. So they would take off their bloody clothes, they would take the car and the tools that the one man had and dump the car into the creek. Now, Buddy would say that he would officially confess if they would put a deal on the table that would spare him from the death penalty. Now, since that's not Paul's decision, it's not even really his case, he would pass all the information along to the DA, who the DA would say, hell no, he wasn't going to go down there and talk to him. They knew who did the murdering, and that man was already dead.
Wow.
Dude, it's so disgusting. And that's where I tell you this case is unsolved, and it seems like every time anybody tries to run down any leads of any way, that there are roadblocks, and I don't understand why. And now you figure Buddy Bristol, he's dead. The other 2 people are apparently still alive.
Maybe.
And in 2023, the Cherokee Marshals would begin a fresh investigation since the crime was committed on the Cherokee Nation Reservation. Now bear in mind that during the trial for Gene, there were plenty of Cherokee that thought Gene was being set up. And I do agree. Also, it wasn't until the Supreme Court decision in 2020, it was McGritt versus Oklahoma, that granted criminal jurisdiction to Muskogee Creek Nation for crimes committed by or on Native Americans within their native land, which, in case you were wondering, is almost all of eastern Oklahoma. Now, that also It had like a little catch on there that the federal government still has the right to bring federal charges against Native Americans in some situations, but it's not really until 2020 that they're even granted the power to have an investigation over it. So that was when you were asking earlier of could they go on. So I feel like since the Cherokee Nation could not really do anything, they weren't up to participating. They're getting walked all over. They don't have any rights. And they're being railroaded by the local police officers who just don't like the Cherokees. So I get where they're not wanting to cooperate in that sense, and they don't necessarily believe that one of their own is that horrible person, especially if they only know the nice side.
But they knew more than the nice side.
Yeah.
Because he confessed to raping those 2 women.
But you figure if somebody you know from childhood showed up and you were just like, oh, no, I didn't do that, you're going to want to believe the good side.
Nope.
Well, it's getting a fresh look, whatever that means. I don't think there will ever be any justice because at this point, I mean, it's over 45 years past. There is no justice that can happen at this point.
No.
Even if they arrested the 2 people that...
However many... Yeah.
Yeah. I don't care how many it is. This isn't justice after that fact.
No.
Because let's face it, even if they were arrested and given the death penalty, they die in jail before they got put to death.
Well, and aside from that, they've lived a full life.
Yeah. And I also feel like I had so many thoughts just then, they all left me.
That's your leaky colander brain.
Mm-hmm. I feel like since both Gene and Buddy Bristol were repeat offenders, that there's a good chance that they didn't live a full life because they're in jail for something else. But talk about no justice for those girls' families. And I think that any law enforcement people really need to... They've got a serious job. And I can't stress it enough that, like, let the evidence do its talking.
Yeah.
I'm so tired of stumbling on these cases where somebody is wanting it so desperately to be that person that they're blind to anything else. And then I feel like once a bad investigation has occurred, then nobody wants to touch it because it went so horribly wrong, like even with the collecting of things.
Yeah, like it ruined the evidence, and it's not until years and years later that fresh eyes are laid on it that they could possibly solve it.
And there's still roadblocks.
Yeah.
And I thought it was disgusting with the DA of, no, he didn't even want to go talk to the feller. That's disgusting.
I'm curious. So were the guys that you named, were they Indian or were they, do you know?
No.
I'm wondering if it was racially motivated. They wanted to believe that it was an Indian that did it, their Gene feller, and didn't want to believe that one of their own people would kill.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I feel like I keep finding these cases where people are wrongly convicted or the case is just horribly solved. And if they would have put better effort into it, they could have solved it. But it seems like it lacked motivation to actually do a good job. I feel like I keep stumbling on those and it gets real frustrating. It also gets frustrating when they do railroad people and get a conviction, which is why I thought it was weird that if Gene did do it, why wouldn't he have just said he did it? I thought it was crazy he admitted to kidnapping and raping pregnant ladies. You'd figure you'd be like, it wasn't me, until they can prove that it was. Because you figure they don't have DNA. I mean, I guess they got eyewitnesses because he rode around with them long enough, but...
Yeah.
But I also thought it was weird if he was loose for 4 years. Why weren't there a slew of crimes if they want to say he was just being a dirty, disgusting criminal?
Maybe there were.
Meh. Well, again, I think Gene's a piece of shit. Wish he could have lived a longer life in jail, but he saved everybody some tax money there.
Funny that he's working out and that's what killed him.
I thought it was a little suspicious, too, because he was only 35 when he died. And it's not like he was an unhealthy looking individual. And I think having a heart attack at 35 seems a little weird. I wasn't sure if it was like a cover up.
If ever there was a reason for the menfolk to use as an excuse not to work out.
I've heard a 35-year-old man had a heart attack and he was just lifting weights and jogging.
It's not good for your health sitting here on this couch.
You got any more thoughts?
No, but it's real sad.
Dude, you should open up the email and see the little girls. There's no gross pictures.
So I've heard that case before.
Both sides?
Yeah.
The theory?
I knew that it was unsolved and that they had railroaded the Gene feller.
Mm-hmm.
And that they had other suspects. So one of the things I remember, the sheriff had raised like $50,000 or something to do additional DNA testing and refused to release the results because it was basically privately funded.
Well, not only that, it's just...
Well, they refused to release the results publicly unless requested by the families, which they chose not to do, which leads me to believe
which is
that
true.
the Hart feller was not the
Matched.
feller that did it. Yeah, because that means they have DNA results and they have no one to match it to, which also makes me think that the people that murdered those girls were not put in jail for anything like serious crime, because that was just in what, like 2019 that was done. So it would be put into a database, and if they had criminals in the system that had their DNA tested, it would have pinged that it connected them. So if it didn't connect to any other criminals, because no charges have ever been brought, it leads me to believe that they murdered these girls and either died or
they did so many other drugs that they're already dead.
Well, yeah, that's why I said died.
But
or
fuck you. But so I sort of agree, and then I also think that if they name anybody, which is why those other two people, unless they are actually charged, you can't just throw somebody's name out there.
Well, I mean, you can. So if the sheriff raised the money to do the DNA test for the family, like if they work together, raise this money, and it pinged to someone's name, there's nothing.
Well, where are the law enforcement though? Like, unless they're already dead is the only way they can't really say anything, because you figure they can't say somebody did it and then they can't defend themselves. They're dead.
Well, they can say that the DNA connected, but they have no other answers. But for whatever reason, those results have never been released, and I find that frustrating. However, if the families have the results, that's ultimately all that's needed. Is they need to know what happened to their girls. Does that make sense?
I also think it's possible if that led to it's in the Cherokee Nation's hands, because they also have all the evidence and all the things that Sheriff Smith had collected. So other than they're giving it a fresh look, I don't know how much effort is being spent on it, because like I said, there's no justice here.
There's not.
But that's all I got.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Homicide Hobbies. If we made you laugh, if we made you cry, or if we mind-fucked you for the day, then we thank you for listening. Please write a review on whatever you're listening to us on. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers. We're freaking awesome. And join us next week for another episode of Homicide Hobbies. I'm Andy.
And I'm Claire.
That's all we've got.